From the Heavens Came Hell, written by U/Azrael, 7000. It all began with a bright light, then a deafening roar. All it took was that, for my home to disappear. My home wasn't the biggest village. There were maybe 100 of us, but as a newly built village, it felt like we were doing okay. My tribe was originally hunters, before one of our elders learned about the best way to get food: just grow your own. This allowed us to finally set up permanent homes, instead of having to move around constantly. Even though growing food was tough, and honestly pretty boring, we were all happy with finally settling down. We had even heard of other tribes similar to us doing the same. We sent envoys to these other tribes, seeing if they needed help or wanted to trade with us. Anything to make life a little easier. I was sent to one of these other tribes that had just established their own community when we saw them in the sky. I had just finished my negotiations when suddenly the tribe's leader and I heard terrified screaming and panicked whispers coming from outside of the leader's hut. We both rushed outside to see what the issue was, thinking maybe a wild beast had broken through the community's newly built wall. As soon as I stepped out of the hut, I stopped dead in my tracks. There in the sky were these things. Like nothing I had ever seen before, they seemed to shine in the light as they hovered in the air. These massive things hovered above the community menacingly, slowly creeping towards us, slowly blocking out the light. We watched in horror as suddenly these smaller things dropped off the giant behemoth in the sky. We saw as fire seemed to shoot off the bottoms of these things as they shot off into different directions. There were hundreds, maybe even thousands, of the smaller creatures falling off the behemoth that seemed to take up the entire sky now. I slowly started to panic. What were these things? Did my home know about this? Were they safe? I needed to warn my home about these monstrous creatures that just seemed to appear in the sky. I looked around me at all of the looks of terror, panic, even some grim acceptance as I slowly turned and ran for the community's gate, trying to run to my home as quickly as possible. I ran as fast and as hard as I could, trying to will the distance to my home to shorten itself. I had run for a long time, feeling my fear and panic rise as time went by. Was everyone alive? Were those creatures at my home too, or just at the other community? I ran harder and faster. I was about to reach my home. It was just over the next hill when suddenly it happened. Another massive behemoth suddenly appeared in the sky, seemingly appearing from nothing. I estimated it was settled right over my home. I stopped and waited for those small creatures to detach themselves from the behemoth so Elle could gauge a good hiding spot from them. That never happened though. As I looked at the behemoth waiting, I instead suddenly was blinded by a great flash of light. It was so bright it felt as if I was staring directly into a fire, and it was causing my eyes themselves to melt. I let out a shriek of pain as I fell to my knees. With myself being blinded, I was unprepared for what happened next. A great and sudden rush of wind hit me. It was so strong that it flung me back onto the ground and caused me to roll for a short distance. Following the wind, there was a deafening roar. This sound caused me even more pain, as it felt like my head was going to explode from the sound. After a short time, the roar seemed to soften before dying out. The wind seemed to stop, and I slowly waited for my eyesight to return. I felt pain from being thrown back by the wind, and my eyes and head were killing me. After another amount of time, I slowly gained my vision again. I saw that the behemoth was still in the sky, but now it was different. On the bottom of it, These two slabs were open, pointing towards the ground. I could only assume that it was its mouth, and it had just opened it and unleashed a roar that could almost kill me. I watched as its mouth closed, and finally those small creatures started to detach from it. I quickly tried standing up. I had to get to my home before those creatures could. I slowly stood and started to carefully make my way over the hill. As I crested it, I could only stand in shock and horror as I looked at the remains of what was once my home. Where once was a small community of huts, people, animals, and even a small wall, there was now nothing. There was a massive hole in the ground. The ground was blackened as if it was set aflame. Whatever that behemoth was, its roar could destroy entire communities. I felt the overwhelming grief and sorrow hit me all at once as I stared into the destruction of my home. I needed to grieve, but I first needed to warn the other communities. I rushed back towards the tribe I had just left. The pain burned deep as I moved. I kept feeling like I was being watched, as if a hungry predator was stalking me, waiting for a chance to strike and gain a quick meal. I glanced up at the behemoth in the sky. It wasn't that. Please don't be that I kept thinking to myself. As I moved, the feeling of being watched got worse and worse. Every step felt like I was stepping into the mouth of one of those behemoths, and it scared me. I kept moving though. The other tribes needed to be warned. As I made my way back to where the other tribe's community was, it was not as I left it. Where once there were huts and a wall to keep predators out, there were now many of those smaller creatures that came from the behemoth. These smaller creatures seemed to be following orders, almost like a hound listening to its master giving them directions. I could only dread the thought that the behemoth was these hounds' master. The hounds reflected the light off of their skin. They were not as small as they appeared to be when coming from the behemoth. They were the size of the chief's hut. They were large. I saw the hounds had their mouths open, just like the behemoth, watched as coming from the hounds, even smaller creatures came out. How many creatures are there? Asked myself. These new creatures were different. There was much variation in size. Some were tall, some were short. Some looked wider than others. They all walked upright just like me though. I noticed there were some similarities between them. First, they were extremely pale. They must not have ever seen the light before. Second, was their large round heads that seemed to contain only one eye that took up their entire face. The eye was shiny, almost like the other creatures. It seemed to almost show their surroundings if you looked directly at it. Finally, each creature seemed to have a bulge coming from their back. It was flat, almost like a carved stone, but it took up a majority of their backs. They looked like spirits, vengeful from beyond, wanting to reclaim the land for their own. I hid, trying to keep out of sight of these many spirits. All I could do was watch in horror as these spirits captured the tribe. They hit the ones that tried to escape and dragged them off to the hounds from which they came. I could hear the screams and wails of the tribe as they were dragged into the mouths of the giant hounds. I watched for what felt like an eternity, listening to the screams of fear slowly turn into wails of agony. Even though I was not close to the spirits or the hounds, I could hear the sound of ripping, cutting, carving. It sounded exactly like when the tribe butchers, the creature we hunted for dinner that night. I tried thinking of a way that I could help the tribe, but I could not think of how I could combat so many terrifying beasts. I realized in horror that I would have to leave them. I would have to abandon this tribe and try to warn the next one. I went to turn to leave, but as I did, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. As I turned to look, everything went black as I felt a sharp and terrible pain hit me in the face. Everything after that is difficult to remember. I remember seeing one of the spirits standing over me, speaking in some rough, horrible-sounding language. Next, I remember being slowly dragged to the community I had just been watching, ground digging painfully in my back as I was dragged. Next, I saw the hound, its mouth opened wide as the spirit dragged me inside. I saw the hound's mouth slowly close, locking the light out as it slowly consumed the both of us whole. I remember being tied down, the wails of agony surrounding me. I looked to the side to witness the tribe's chief hanging on a wall, his chest cut open, skin pulled back. I saw his insides were now on the outside. One of the spirits held a small object and walked around the chief, pointing the object towards the chief. I looked up, trying to put this horrifying sight behind me. Only now I was blinded by the brightest light I had ever seen. I closed my eyes, trying to block the light and the sound of screams from my mind. Suddenly, the light was blocked. I opened my eyes only to see the terrifying visage of one of the spirits looking down at me. I saw my reflection in its one giant eye. I saw the terror, pain, and despair reflected in that eye. I watched as it raised a small object just like the one the other spirit had pointed at the chief. After the spirit played with it for a moment, it raised its other hand. This hand was holding a small but extremely sharp knife. I watched in despair as the knife descended towards me. From there, I only remember agony, pure and utter agony. They sliced my chest, and just like the chief, pulled my insides outside. Every cut left me in the worst pain I have ever felt. But every time I could also hear the spirit speak in the horrifying language. Once they pulled the last of my insides out, the spirit did many things with them. It put them on weird devices, spoke even more in that horrible language, and even tossed them into the air, before slowly putting them back inside of me. This process was even more painful than them being removed, as the creature basically threw them back inside me without any care. After the creature finished, it raised the knife again, this time cutting my neck. This time the spirit was quick. After it peeled my skin away from my neck, it pointed the small object towards it before putting down the knife and grabbing a tiny object that was near it. The object was small, almost invisible except for the glint in the light when the spirit moved its hand. The spirit moved this object and shoved it into my neck. I felt as this spirit's hand moved around in my neck, pulling my very life around as it seemed to reposition the inside of my neck to its liking. After an eternity, it pulled its hand back before slowly putting my skin back in place and moving on. Next, it checked my face. It opened my mouth and with a yank ripped a tooth from my mouth. With all of this happening, I kept trying to scream, but it was as if I was paralyzed and couldn't move or scream. I felt everything. I felt as it pulled one of my eyes from its socket. There was a strand connected to the back of my eye, but I realized in horror that I could still see in the eye. I watched in excruciating pain as the spirit turned my eye around, and I realized I could see myself. I mentally screamed as the spirit pulled the strand from the back of my eye, and I realized I had lost sight in that eye. Next, it drove a spike into one of my ears. The spike was as long as my hand and as sharp as the spirit's knife. As soon as it was placed, everything started to spin. Elle cried tears of pain, despair, and most of all, unbearable suffering. As I wept, I noticed something strange. The harsh language spoken by these spirits, I could slowly understand it. I listened and realized I could only understand it when a spirit spoke on the side. The spike was in my ear. The other side still sounded harsh and unforgiving. "Sir, The language translation device has been implanted and should be functional, the spirit said. Another spirit on my other side responded, but I could not understand it. Suddenly, the device I was strapped to rose and lifted me into a standing position. Just like the chief, I was now tied to the wall, chest cut open, and watching in horror as my insides seemed to move and try to fall outside once again. There seemed to be some type of cloth that ensured that didn't happen, but it was terrifying, as well as agonizing to see and feel my insides move and struggle to come out. There was a spirit standing in front of me, its one giant eye staring at me, taunting me. I saw there was another cloth wrapped around my neck, keeping me from reaching the release of death. This spirit and I stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Slowly, I watched as the spirit reached up and pushed a small object on the side of its head. I watched in horror as the yellow eye slowly disappeared, replaced with a clear visage. Inside, I saw a creature. It had a face similar to ours. It had eyes, a mouth, a nose, and hair. The only difference was, this creature had pale skin. Not as pale as the skin on the outside, but still pale enough to show a lack of time in the light. This sight only strengthened my belief that these were vengeful spirits, beings from the past here to reclaim what was once theirs. This spirit and I stared at each other for a while longer, before finally I heard it say, "Hello, unidentified alien species. My name is Major Robert Gardner of the United Nations Space Defense Force, and I have a few questions for you." This is the end of the story. Thank you for listening. The story will be linked in the description, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories.